Hey everybody, welcome back to Science versus Atheism. In part 8, we're going to go over the next two objections, and we'll get right into it, beginning with creationist objection number 2. Quote, natural selection is based on circular reasoning. The fittest are those who survive, and those who survive are deemed the fittest. Close quote. This statement is probably Mr. Rennie's translation of the position of the creationists. If we substitute survival of the fittest in the above statement for natural selection, then this objection is correct. Why he then disagrees is unclear, but he does. His response, quote, survival of the fittest is a conversational way to describe natural selection, close quote. Here he has made an incorrect link, that is, he commits a fallacy of transfer. Natural selection and survival of the fittest are not really the same concept even within the context of evolution. The justification for the authority of that part of natural selection that lies within the testable portion of microevolution cannot properly be transferred to the remainder of microevolution, much less to macroevolution, which is where his claims concerning survival of the fittest lie. He then commits a non sequitur by citing an observational study that reasons as to cause and effect of balances in population observations of certain bird species. The study referred to is at best only tertiary science. Most such studies are non-controllable ex post facto analyses of conclusionary interpretations used as quote-unquote proof of hypotheticals. That is, at the very best, they are fallacies of converse logic. There is a much deeper problem, one common to the reasoning frequently used by the organic evolutionists, namely the extrapolation from a one-time observational study to a philosophical conjecture that feign claims to be a scientific theory, which is then feign claimed to be truth. A vast leap of faith indeed. Such studies are usually one-time in content and anecdotal in nature, thus cannot be tested as scientific theory, and even if they could, cannot, from that platform, justifiably be classified as truth. Anecdotal one-time observations are never properly considered to yield primary science. The power and authority he fain claims it to have requires that it be a primary science, which requires controllability, repeatability, and consistent statistically confined measurements to justify such claims. As noted, they at best consist only of rather weak tertiary science. Such ad hoc formats cannot be seriously considered as proof for anything concerning true scientific endeavors, since no scientific model can be proven as true in the first place. And that's the end of the response to creationist objection number 2. We're going to move on to creationist objection number 3. Quote, evolution is unscientific because it is not testable or falsifiable. It makes claims about events that were not observed and can never be recreated. Close quote. Why Mr. Rennie disagrees with this is puzzling, since it is transparently correct as stated, even to his own admission. What follows in the response is a classic example of the fallacy of transfer by a shift of base to a different platform. Quote, this blanket dismissal of evolution ignores important distinctions that divide the field into two broad areas, microevolution and macroevolution. Close quote. Following this admission, he then attempts to erase the distinction of the two and also between the subdivisions that exist, which he himself has made. Sweep the whole of it into one unit and by association claim that what little of microevolution that deals with true science thereby applies to the whole of his conglomeration. The first paragraph contains two may-be references, and these are then transported to science. Such reasoning is best described as McElligot's pool reasoning. Dr. Seuss, quote, if such a thing could be, it certainly would be, close quote. And to quote Mr. Rennie, changes that may be preludes to speciation, and macroevolution's evidence draws from the fossil record and DNA comparisons to reconstruct, not possible by the way, how various organisms may be related. Note, there is not, nor can there be any possibility of actual direct testing, only hypothetical may-be's that become his reality. That is, could-be's and may-be's become did-be's. I'm going to interject for a moment just to clarify what my father's talking about with McElligot's pool reasoning. I don't know how many of you read that Dr. Seuss book, but it's about a farmer who's telling a little kid who's fishing in just this crappy little pond that there's nothing in there but garbage and he's not going to catch any fish. And the kid goes off on all this wild conjecture about what might be in there, about how there might be an underground stream. And if there is, then there might be fish. And because it's possible, that's what's happening. And he kind of implies that because all of this is possible, therefore that is what's going to happen. And that's exactly what these scientists like to do. They get so hypnotized by all the possibilities that the possibilities, the more they talk about them, they gradually become reality for these people, and they lose focus on what they have tested, what they have direct access to, which is never very much. But they paint this fantastic narrative, wondrous pronouncements begin to flow forth, as my father put it earlier. Continuing on, quote, "These days even most creationists acknowledge that microevolution has been upheld by tests in the laboratory," close quote. Well, not quite. Only that small portion of microevolution that can be subjected to the requirements of the scientific method, and only then as to the effectiveness of the indicated hypotheses, not to their certainty or to their truth. This is, as noted earlier, the standard fallacy of transfer that permeates the whole of the article. Quote, "The historical nature of macroevolutionary study involves inferences from fossils and DNA rather than direct observation," close quote. We simply note that such inferences are subjective in substance and are not innate. This is one of the reasons that direct testing is required. To assert that any inference validates or justifies anything within the domain of the sciences is, prima facie, a gross error, specifically a fallacy of transfer. Yet this is the only thing the macroevolutionist does or can offer. He then commits a non-standard fallacy of converse logic by asserting that the hypotheses are tested for truth by checking the future. It should be repeated here that there is always a silent accommodating drift to adjust the conjectures to new information as it becomes available. That is, most such explanations are essentially philosophical, ad hoc, and after the fact. It is far too much a stretch to assert that any ad hoc philosophical explanation deserves the same position and authority as is given to the truly scientific. I'm going to interject once again to explain that what my father is referring to when he mentions this silent accommodating drift is the way these pseudosciences keep changing as little bits of incoming data render the previous consensus invalid. For example, remember how we were told for years that human life began somewhere in Africa? And for years people embraced that as truth, which was verified by science. But then just recently, some new evidence pops up, and they all said, it appears human life actually originated somewhere in Europe. Well, guess what? That is just as likely to be as false as, or better yet, as unknown as, the Africa theory. The cause of this phenomenon of conveniently changing narratives is the fact that these theories are not scientific. They are stories constructed ex post facto to fit the circumstances. In other words, the entire narrative is one gigantic fallacy of converse logic. Here's a solid rule of thumb for you. If somebody is telling you an elaborate tale about events which have no living eyewitnesses or written testimony to confirm it, then you can 100% safely call BS on their story. And they'll get mad and tell you that this is what scientists say. You're not anti-science, are you? If the event in question is inaccessible for direct physical testing in the present, then the opinions of scientists carry no authority. They're as clueless as everyone else. In fact, let me give you guys an example from my work in the laboratory. If I'm reviewing the accumulated data from a given study, and most of the data from the test phase is missing entirely, and the one and only analyst who performed the testing is long dead, what do? Do I just assume the test phase went off without a hitch? How do I know the results are even valid if I don't have the test data? Or you think I'm going to make assumptions about the testing just by looking at the results? Oh, maybe reverse engineer some nice logically sound test phase data? Yeah, if I want to lose my job, that's what I'll do. There are too many possibilities and nothing whatsoever can be verified. The test articles would be deemed unsuitable for analysis, and the remainder of the data would be discarded without question or hesitation. And this is because the past is inaccessible. If you are assuming events that are unverifiable, then you are committing the fallacy of converse logic, because you're only looking at a conclusion and then making up a subjectively logical series of steps which lead to that conclusion, and then you're calling your little creation science, regardless of the utter lack of testability. And if you're wondering why this doesn't apply to theism, well, the answer is it actually does apply to quite a bit of theism. But theists have scripture. Call it some crotchety old records all you want, but it is testimony. It may not be verifiable or even reliably translated, but at least it's something. Anyway, forgive the lengthy digression. Let's continue. It is noteworthy that whenever information is forthcoming that is at variance with and contradicts the accepted interpretations, it has invariably been dismissed as fraudulent, ignored, depreciated, or correctly reinterpreted. All such treatments are simply ad fallacies. The article falsely claims that no such information has ever surfaced on the whole by drawing from claims relating only to a particular corner of the subject, and even those claims may be legitimately challenged. Reference is made to Karl Popper's concept of falsifiability, which essentially requires that an explanation that cannot be tested as valid or invalid, i.e. effective or ineffective, must be relegated to philosophical conjecture. That is, it does not fall within the confines of science. Mr. Rennie considers this to be too narrow because it excludes too many clearly scientific endeavors from being considered as scientific. Well, this is exactly why precise language should be used. It exposes false reasoning, especially the fallacy of transfer that Mr. Rennie is committing here. If these disciplines were truly scientific, then there would be no problem in the first place. Let the chips fall where they may. Why in the name of honesty and precision would anyone want to do otherwise? Now, I'm going to interject here because I feel my father didn't drive this point home sufficiently. What this author has just intimated is that he's going to ignore the definition of science, the process by which we've attained our current level of prosperity, because it inconveniently excludes his atheistic religious beliefs. So he's going to broaden the definition of science, because that's how we obtain greater precision and clarity of thought, right? By broadening definitions so that they mean whatever we need them to mean? Yeah, I don't think so either. Well, that's it for this section. Thank you for listening.